They thought they were untouchable until it was already too late. Tonight's story takes us back to 1859, where a single enslaved man carried out one of the most shocking and carefully hidden acts of revenge in American history, leaving 19 overseers permanently blinded and no one seeing it coming. This isn't folklore or rumor, it's a story pieced together from plantation records, medical notes, and witness accounts that were never meant to survive. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And if you value deeply researched, true historical stories that uncover what history tried to bury, make sure you subscribe, because finding and verifying stories like this takes serious work and dedication. He was not the kind of man anyone watched closely, and that was exactly why his story began the way it did. On paper, he was listed as nothing more than a field hand transferred between properties in the late 1850s, a quiet presence whose name barely appeared in plantation records. He was small in stature, soft-spoken, and unusually observant, the kind of enslaved man overseers dismissed as harmless. But beneath that silence was a mind sharpened by years of punishment, humiliation, and watching cruelty repeat itself without consequence. From a young age, he learned the most important survival skill on a plantation: invisibility. He listened more than he spoke. He kept his eyes lowered. He never reacted when insulted or beaten. Overseers remembered him as useful and obedient, words that often meant someone who could be trusted with small freedoms. He was allowed to move between work areas, assist with tools, carry water, clean equipment, and occasionally serve near the overseer's quarters. That access was rare, and it gave him something far more valuable than strength: information. He watched how overseers behaved when no one else was around. He learned which men washed their faces carelessly, which rubbed their eyes with dirty hands, which drank from shared buckets without thought. He noticed how medical treatment worked on plantations, or more accurately, how it failed. Eye injuries were common from dust, insects, and sun exposure, but rarely treated properly. Overseers mocked enslaved people for illness, yet ignored their own symptoms until pain became unbearable. He stored these observations quietly, patiently, never giving any hint that he was studying them. What made him especially trusted was his role as a helper during long summer days. In 1859, Alabama heat was relentless, and overseers depended on water carriers more than ever. He was often assigned to bring water, rinse cloths, and help with basic hygiene after hours in the fields. He never complained, never resisted, and never showed anger, even when beaten unjustly. That consistency made him predictable in their eyes. Predictability meant safety, and safety meant no one suspected him of anything beyond obedience. Some overseers even spoke to him casually, venting frustrations, making jokes they assumed he could not fully understand. But he understood everything. He memorized routines, shift changes, and the order in which overseers rotated between plantations. He noticed how often men shared towels, basins, and tools. He watched them spit, wipe sweat from their eyes, and laugh about infections that would clear up on their own. Each detail mattered. Each habit became part of a growing mental map. There was also something else that helped him blend in: grief mistaken for weakness. Records suggest he had lost family members under brutal circumstances, possibly to punishment or illness. Afterward, he became quieter than before, withdrawn, emotionally distant. Overseers assumed he was broken. They mistook his silence for surrender. That assumption became their greatest mistake. He never rushed. Whatever he was planning, it was not born of rage or impulse. It was built slowly, shaped by observation and restraint. He waited until he was placed in positions where no one questioned his presence, carrying water, cleaning shared items, assisting during injuries. Trust was the key, and he earned it by being everything they expected an enslaved man to be: submissive, forgettable, replaceable. By the time the first overseer complained of sudden eye pain, no one even thought to look in his direction. He was already part of the background, a shadow moving through the plantation unnoticed. And that was exactly how he needed it to be, because the most effective revolts in history were never loud or immediate. Some were silent, patient, and hidden behind lowered eyes, until the damage was already done and no one could undo it. What made what happened next so terrifying was not just the outcome, but how ordinary it all seemed at first. There was no single dramatic moment, no screams, no obvious act of violence. The method was so subtle that for weeks, in some cases months, no one connected the suffering to a cause at all. Overseers believed they were dealing with coincidence, bad luck, or the harsh Alabama climate. By the time the pattern emerged, the damage was already irreversible. The first man complained of irritation. His eyes burned after long days in the fields, watering constantly, swollen and red. That was nothing unusual. Dust, sweat, insects, and sun glare were common hazards, and overseers prided themselves on ignoring pain. They mocked enslaved workers for weakness, while boasting of their own endurance. So when the irritation worsened, he rubbed his eyes harder, rinsed them with shared water, and used whatever cloth was nearest. That simple response, careless, habitual, turned discomfort into agony. Within days, his vision blurred. Light became unbearable. The whites of his eyes darkened, inflamed, and streaked with yellow. Still, no alarm was raised. Plantation medicine was crude, dismissive, and deeply flawed. Doctors were rarely called unless death seemed imminent. Eye injuries, no matter how severe, were often treated with home remedies, dirty poultices, or nothing at all. The overseer was told to rest, avoid the sun, and wait. He did, and he went blind. The second and third cases followed the same path. At first, no one thought to connect them. The men worked different shifts, supervised different groups, and lived in separate quarters. But they shared habits, washing stations, tools, towels, basins, and water sources. What made the method so devastating was how it exploited routine. Nothing new had to be introduced suddenly. Everything passed through normal channels, unnoticed, unquestioned. Pain came first, then swelling, then darkness. By the time overseers could no longer see shapes or faces, it was too late. Some screamed in terror when night fell and the darkness never lifted. Others sank into silence, ashamed and confused, unable to understand how something so small had stolen something so vital. Blindness was not just a physical loss, it meant the end of authority, status, and usefulness. A blind overseer was a liability. As more men fell victim, panic spread. Rumors of field sickness circulated. Some blamed contaminated water. Others blamed punishment from God, or curses whispered by the enslaved population. But no one suspected intentional harm, because the idea was unthinkable to them. They believed control was absolute. They believed enslaved people were incapable of planning, patience, or precision. That belief blinded them long before their eyes failed. Doctors were finally called when the number reached double digits. Medical notes from the period describe confusion, contradiction, and fear. Some doctors believed it was a rare infection. Others suspected environmental poisoning. Treatments varied wildly: bleeding salves, rinses that only worsened the damage. One physician reportedly warned that whatever was causing it spread through contact, but by then it had already moved through multiple plantations. What made the method especially cruel and effective was that it turned the overseer's own negligence against them. Their refusal to provide clean water, proper medical care, or humane conditions created the perfect environment for catastrophe. Their habit of sharing supplies without sanitation accelerated the spread. Their arrogance ensured they ignored early warnings. Every choice they made deepened the damage. By the time the count reached 19, the truth was undeniable: something systematic had occurred. But even then, the response was denial rather than justice. Plantations quietly dismissed the blind overseers, relocating them or sending them away to avoid scandal. Records were altered. Causes of blindness were left vague. The idea that an enslaved man could have orchestrated such destruction was too dangerous to acknowledge. And the man at the center of it all, he remained invisible. No accusation stuck. No evidence pointed directly to him. Whatever he had done, he did it in a way that left no single moment to seize, no weapon to confiscate, no confession to force. The damage spoke for itself. But the method vanished into silence. That was the true horror of it. Not just that 19 men lost their sight, but that it happened through patience, observation, and the quiet use of systems already in place. It was not chaos. It was control reversed. And by the time anyone realized what was happening, the darkness had already settled in, permanent, unyielding, and impossible to undo. What made the entire situation even more terrifying was not just what was happening, but how long it went unnoticed. The blindness did not arrive suddenly or dramatically. It crept in slowly, disguised as something ordinary, something the overseers believed they understood. That delay was critical. It allowed the damage to spread quietly, plantation to plantation, man to man, without ever triggering immediate suspicion. By the time anyone realized there was a pattern, it was already far too late to stop it. At first, each case appeared isolated. One overseer complained of eye pain after a long day in the sun. Another blamed dust storms or insects. A third thought it was simply age catching up with him. In the harsh conditions of 1859, Alabama, eye problems were common. Overseers spent long hours staring into glare, smoke, and dirt. Redness and irritation were expected, even joked about. No one kept detailed medical records for men who were considered replaceable employees. And certainly no one imagined that these small complaints were part of something deliberate. The real reason no one connected the cases early on was arrogance. Overseers believed themselves immune to harm from those they controlled. The idea that an enslaved man could patiently observe, plan, and execute something so precise simply did not exist in their minds. That belief acted like a blindfold. They assumed danger could only come from open rebellion, violence, or escape attempts, loud acts that could be punished swiftly. Quiet suffering did not register as a threat. There was also distance working in the man's favor. The overseers were spread across different properties, often miles apart. They reported to different owners, followed different schedules, and rarely compared personal health issues with one another. When one man lost his sight, he was quietly dismissed or sent away. When another followed weeks later, it was treated as coincidence. Plantation owners had no interest in investigating too deeply. Blind overseers raised uncomfortable questions, and questions led to scrutiny. Silence was easier. Medical confusion played a major role as well. When doctors were eventually consulted, they disagreed sharply. Some blamed infections, others environmental toxins, others divine punishment. Treatments varied wildly and often worsened the condition. Without a clear medical explanation, each case was handled individually. No centralized authority tracked symptoms or timelines. No one stepped back to ask why the same outcome kept repeating under similar conditions. The lack of proper medicine allowed the truth to hide behind uncertainty. Another factor was fear of scandal. Plantation owners depended on the image of control. A mysterious illness spreading among overseers suggested weakness, poor management, or worse, vulnerability. Admitting that something was wrong could invite outside attention or unrest among the enslaved population. So cases were buried quietly. Men were relocated. Records were altered. Causes of blindness were vaguely described or omitted entirely. This deliberate suppression fractured the evidence, making the pattern harder to see. Meanwhile, the man responsible continued his work unnoticed. His role was so ordinary, so routine, that no one questioned his presence. He moved where he had always moved. He handled what he had always handled. Nothing about his behavior changed in a way that would draw attention. That consistency was crucial. Suspicion thrives on deviation, and he gave them none. Even as fear grew among the overseers, their eyes never turned downward. When whispers finally began, when men started quietly warning each other not to touch certain water basins, not to rub their eyes, not to share cloths, the damage was already widespread. These warnings came too late. The initial exposure had already taken hold, and the crude treatments only accelerated the harm. Panic replaced confidence. But panic without understanding led nowhere. By the time someone finally suggested that the cases might be connected, the idea was dismissed as superstition. Overseers accused one another of weakness. Doctors argued. Owners blamed weather god or fate. The truth required acknowledging that the power dynamic they relied on was flawed, that someone they believed incapable had outthought them. That realization was more frightening than blindness itself. So the pattern remained hidden, not because the signs weren't there, but because no one was willing to see them. The system itself protected the act. It discouraged investigation, silenced communication, and punished curiosity. The blindness was not just physical, it was cultural, psychological, and deliberate. When the final count reached 19, the realization came not with clarity, but with dread. Something had happened, something coordinated, something that could not be undone, and still, no one could point to the moment it began or the hands that caused it. That was the most devastating part. The damage had spread in plain sight, wrapped in normalcy, protected by arrogance, and sustained by silence. By the time the truth began to surface in whispers, the darkness had already settled permanently. And the reason they never saw it coming was simple. They never believed they needed to look. Once the number of blinded overseers reached a point that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence, fear spread faster than the illness ever had. It began quietly, in whispers exchanged late at night, in half-spoken warnings muttered between men who had once ruled with confidence. Overseers who had laughed off eye pain weeks earlier now slept with cloths tied over their faces, afraid to touch anything without washing their hands again and again. The same men who enforced cruelty without hesitation now feared the simplest acts of daily life. Panic had entered the system, and it had no clear target. Plantation owners were the first to feel it. Blind overseers meant chaos. These men were the backbone of control, the enforcers who kept the fields running and the enslaved population subdued. Losing them so suddenly created instability that could not be openly acknowledged. Owners feared rebellion, feared rumors spreading, feared outside attention during a time when the nation itself was already tearing apart. Instead of seeking truth, they sought containment. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Letters were written and quietly burned. Instructions were given to speak as little as possible. Medical panic followed. Doctors were summoned in increasing numbers, but their presence only deepened the confusion. Each arrived with a different explanation and a different cure. Some claimed the blindness was caused by a rare infection of the eyes. Others blamed contaminated water or poisonous plants. A few suggested it might be spread by contact, but no one could agree on how or why. Treatments ranged from useless to brutal. Eyes were blood, scraped, washed with harsh chemicals, and wrapped in poultices that worsened the damage. Each failed attempt added to the sense that something unnatural was at work. Rumors took root where answers failed. Some overseers believed they were being punished by God. Others whispered of curses, of poison dust carried in the air, of revenge taken in ways no one could see. Fear turned them suspicious of one another. Shared spaces were avoided. Longtime colleagues refused to shake hands. Men who had once trusted their surroundings now watched every movement with dread. The very routines that had once symbolized control became sources of terror. The enslaved population noticed the change immediately. The men who once walked with authority now stumbled, shouted in confusion, or disappeared altogether. Power weakened, and with it came unease. But even then, no one dared to speak openly. Silence ruled both sides. The overseers were afraid to admit vulnerability. Plantation owners were afraid of scandal. Doctors were afraid of being wrong. Fear locked every mouth shut. As panic intensified, so did attempts to erase the problem rather than solve it. Blind overseers were quietly removed, sent away under vague pretenses, or dismissed without explanation. Records were altered. Causes of blindness were written vaguely, if at all. Some plantations reported accidents. Others cited illness without detail. The goal was not understanding, but disappearance. If the evidence could be scattered, the threat might seem smaller than it truly was. Meanwhile, the fear spread beyond Alabama. Word traveled between plantations, between states, carried by traders and physicians. Overseers elsewhere began reporting eye pain, even when nothing was wrong. Panic created symptoms of its own. Men stared at mirrors searching for signs of redness. Any irritation became a potential death sentence to their authority. Confidence collapsed into paranoia. What made the panic especially destructive was that it had no enemy to strike. There was no rebellion to crush, no weapon to confiscate, no man to publicly punish. The threat was invisible, embedded in the everyday. That uncertainty shattered the illusion of control more thoroughly than violence ever could. Power depends on certainty, and certainty was gone. By the time plantation owners realized that fear itself was becoming destabilizing, it was too late. Trust had evaporated. Authority was weakened, and the silence that followed was not calm. It was the heavy quiet of men who knew something had beaten them without ever stepping into the open. That panic, that medical confusion, that refusal to confront the truth became the final stage of the act itself. Not only were 19 men blinded, but an entire system was forced to confront its own fragility. And in that moment of fear and denial, the greatest damage was done, because the truth was buried not out of ignorance, but out of terror of what it revealed. What happened next was not justice, not investigation, and certainly not accountability. It was erasure. Once the fear settled and the reality became impossible to ignore, the system did what it had always done best. It buried the truth. Not because it couldn't be uncovered, but because uncovering it would have shattered the illusion that enslaved people were powerless, incapable, and eternally controlled. The truth was far more dangerous than the blindness itself. Plantation owners understood immediately what was at stake. If it became known that a single enslaved man had quietly outwitted an entire network of overseers, the consequences would be catastrophic. Authority depended on fear flowing in only one direction. This story reversed that flow. So instead of asking how it happened, they asked how quickly it could be forgotten. Records were rewritten. Medical reports were altered to list vague causes like field sickness, a fever, or sudden degeneration. In some cases, the word blindness never appeared at all. The overseers who lost their sight were removed discreetly. Some were sent back to relatives in other states. Others disappeared from payrolls without explanation. A few were rumored to have been confined to poorhouses or asylums, where their stories would never be taken seriously. Blind men carried no authority, and powerless men made inconvenient witnesses. Their silence was not requested. It was enforced by circumstance and shame. Doctors who suspected deliberate contamination faced pressure to keep quiet. Plantation medicine relied on owners for payment and protection. Suggesting that an enslaved man had engineered the outbreak would invite scrutiny, retaliation, and professional ruin. So uncertainty was allowed to stand. Conflicting diagnoses filled journals. Contradictions replaced conclusions. Medicine became a fog behind which the truth could hide safely. The most chilling part was what happened to the man himself. There is no arrest record, no trial, no punishment documented. Not because he was innocent, but because accusing him would require acknowledging that he was capable, and that admission was unacceptable. Instead, he vanished from records altogether. His name stops appearing, his transfers end. It is unclear whether he was quietly sold, relocated, killed, or simply absorbed back into the system under another identity. History does not record his fate, because history was never meant to. In the years that followed, plantation communities avoided speaking of the incident. New overseers were hired with warnings that were vague and fearful. Hygiene practices changed quietly. Shared water sources were altered, but no one explained why. The changes were treated like superstition rather than response. Silence became policy. Even after the Civil War, when records resurfaced and stories emerged, this one remained fractured. Fragments appeared in journals, medical notes, and whispered family accounts, but never in full. Each source hinted at something larger, something coordinated, something intentional, yet none connected the final dots. That absence was deliberate. History is not just what is written, it is what is prevented from being written. What remains today is not a name, not a face, but a consequence. 19 men blinded, a system shaken, A truth erased because it proved something forbidden, that intelligence, patience, and resistance existed everywhere power claimed it did not. The act itself was not remembered as rebellion, because rebellion implies open defiance. This was something else entirely. It was control reclaimed silently. That is why the story survives only in pieces. Because to tell it fully would mean admitting that the most effective revolts are not always loud, not always violent, and not always visible. Sometimes they are quiet, methodical, and devastating, carried out by those history was never supposed to notice. And that is the real reason his name was buried. Not because what he did was unclear, but because what it proved was unforgivable.